Welcome to Femme and Furious, a podcast where pop culture meets a feminine framing. I am your host, Julia Rose Portella, and today we are dropping into North Bear Shores to the Red, White Russians, and Blue Book Club, where we will be discussing Beach Read by Emily Henry. This is one of 5 quickie recaps that we will be doing over the course of this month for Emily Henry's rom-com novel that I will be covering over the course of June. But before we dive in today, let me tell you how you can subscribe to the pod. You can follow the podcast on Instagram at FemandFuriousPod. You can also subscribe on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. You can watch every episode on Spotify or YouTube. And if you have any thoughts, feelings, comments, opinions about any of Emily Henry's works, okay, we have a lot to talk about over the course of these weeks. I feel like we should do a mailbag episode at the end of this. So you've got mailbag, because there's a lot about dead parents, a lot about cults, and a whole bunch of other stuff. So if you haven't already listened to Great Big Beautiful Life, I've already recorded that. But if you have other thoughts, feelings, opinions, you can send them in. The inbox is open. That is at femandfuriouspod@gmail.com. And last but not least, you can join the Two Femme, Two Furious community. That is $10 a month. It gets you Femme and Furious fully loaded bonus episodes. It gets you a 15% discount on merch and live events. Sunday Brunch, which is a virtual monthly hangout. It gets you the Suffragette Award, which gives you voting privileges on episode topics and more. Tea Time, which is the online chat. And then Fast Five, which is a weekly content roundup. Last but not least, before we dive in today, the podcast is changing dates to Tuesday and Friday. So if you were like, where was the podcast this week so far? I had a little bit of a snafu with my sound, and so we're back on track. Hopefully. I had to re-record this episode. Coming back to this after I have now read all 5 Emily Henry books. It's been interesting to take a look at this, the show notes again for this. But anyway, the podcast will now be releasing on Tuesdays and Fridays. With that being said, let's jump into our chic peek. We are looking at Beach Read by Emily Henry. This is a contemporary romance or a rom-com, and the synopsis is, after discovering her late father's secret life, January spends the summer packing and selling his second home. Down on her luck, January must push past the pain to churn out another book by the end of summer. To add fuel to fire, her next-door neighbor is her old college writing rival, and when the two agree to swap writing genres for the summer, the question won't be if they can accomplish the task, but can they avoid a summer fling along the way? Our tropes and micro-tropes. Opposites attract, rivals to lovers, second-ish chance, and he fell first. I love a man who yearns, and Gus Everett, is a man who yearns. I love him. I will be surprised at the end of this series if he's not at the top of my book boyfriend list for all of Emily Henry's book boys. So there's one who I think may come above him, but Gus is like really up there for me. I read this book and I was like, yeah, I remember why I fell in love with romance novels again. And it was because of Emily Henry, and it was because of this book. So shout out to Gus. Bad name, hot guy. So let's go with judging the cover. There's nothing particular that stands out about this cover, unlike Great Big Beautiful Life, which I had a lot to say about that cover. So you can go listen to that episode if you're interested in hearing it. But for this one, nothing in particular. We just have January and Gus hanging out on the beach, which is something that they actually don't do pretty much any of. They do it like once throughout the course of this whole book. So it says beach read because we are technically on the beach, but we don't ever spend time on the beach, which is much to my dismay because I am a beach baddie for sure. And then let's do a who's who. So we have January Andrews, who is a romance writer and a hopeless romantic. We have Augustus Gus Everett, or S.E.G., Sexy Evil Gus, who is a literary fiction writer and eternal pessimist with hashtag abandonment issues. We have Shady, who is January's whimsical best friend. We have Naomi, who is Gus' wife, who left him for his BFF, and all I kept thinking about was Bridget Jones' Diary, which comes up in like pretty much every single one of Emily Henry's books in some capacity or another. And then we have Jacques, who is January's shitty ex-boyfriend who dumps her in a hot tub. And then we have January's parents, who we'll be talking about too. But as far as like named characters who will probably come up today during our episode, that's who we'll be talking about. Let's dive into our Fem Frame, where we will look at key feminist themes, herstory, cultural context, and more. So one thing that really stood out to me for this book as like a key feminist theme for this episode is double standards in genre writing, fiction versus women's fiction. And here are just like some quotes from the book, and then we'll dive a little bit deeper. So I'm sorry, because this is going to be like a dramatic reading of a bunch of quotes that I just put on here, but they felt important. They stood out to me, and I just thought this was a really interesting topic, especially in a romance novel. So let's dive in. There is a quote from January where she says, "I never corrected people when they said singular book rather than plural books, but sometimes the assumption dug under my skin. It made me feel like people thought my career was a fluke, like I'd sneezed and a romance novel came out. And then there were the people who acted like we were in on some secret joke together when after a conversation about art or politics, they found out I wrote upbeat women's fiction, whatever pays the bills, right? They'd say, practically begging me to confirm that I didn't want to write books about women or love." So this is her starting to divulge her abrasion with people's response to romance, especially because it's such an important genre for her, which we'll talk about. Then we have this quote where January and Gus are in the bookstore and they're talking to each other, and she goes, "You never tell me what you write, Everett. I'm sure it's really groundbreaking and important. Totally new and fresh. Like a story about a disillusioned white guy wandering the world, misunderstood and coldly horny." A laugh barked out of him. Coldly horny? As opposed to the very artfully handled sexual proclivities of your genre? Tell me, which do you find more fascinating to write, love-struck pirates or love-struck werewolves? And now I was seething again. Well, it's not really about me so much as what my readers want. What's it like writing Hemingway's circle jerk fan fiction? Do you know all your readers by name? So I love that they have this sort of back and forth because it pulls us into the stigma, even though we end up finding out that Gus doesn't actually feel this way about her or her works. In fact, he's read all of her writing. But then we have, January throwing back, hey, like, there's stereotype and stigma for your genre as well. And this is where we start to see, like, this goes very deep for her. It's important to her. And I think it's an important conversation to have if we're discussing feminism, especially in literature and things like that, because she goes on to make some really, really good points. One of those points would be that she discusses that people make women's fiction semi-autobiographical. So she has this quote where she says, "Besides, why does everyone try to make women's writing semi-autobiographical? Do people generally assume that your lonely white male, coldly horny," Gus inserted, "coldly horny protagonists are you?" So I love that she also pulls this in because this is true and it's hard not to do. And I found myself really checking in with this as I was going through the book, because there are some things that I was like, I wonder if Emily Henry has experienced that, And now having got to the end of all of her most recent rom-coms from like 2020 until now, 2019 until now, I will say that there are definitely some things that I'm like, they have to be semi-autobiographical because they're just in every single one of her books. And so you can tell they must be an extension of her. But I think it's interesting, right, that this quote is in there, that people try to make women's writing semi-autobiographical and what that means and why it's different from what we would consider like fiction about men or like fiction by men, written by men, and what those protagonists are doing. And then she's got this quote, "Okay, that's not the kind of romance I write. In fact, my books aren't even shelved as romance technically. They're shelved as women's fiction." Gus slumped against the booth and stretched his lean olive arms over his head, rolling his wrists to make them crack. "I don't understand why there'd need to be a full genre that's just books for women." "Yeah, well, you're not the only one who doesn't understand it," I said. "I know how to tell a story, Gus, and I know how to string a sentence together. If you swapped out all my Jessicas for Johns, do you know what you'd get? Fiction. Just fiction. Ready and willing to be read by anyone. But somehow, by being a woman who writes about women, I've eliminated half the Earth's population from my potential readers. And you know what? I don't feel ashamed of that. I feel pissed. that people like you assume my books couldn't possibly be worth your time, while meanwhile you could shart on live TV and the New York Times would praise your bold display of humanity. And then the last quote that I have here that I highlighted was, "It does exactly what I aim to do. It makes readers feel known and understood, like their stories, women's stories, matter." So this idea of a double standard in genre writing is mentioned a bunch of times by January, and it's important to her. It's something that she thinks about clearly. And so this begs the question, like, when did women's fiction become a separate genre altogether? And that's what I wanted to dive into today for the FemFrame. When I looked into who was the first female author, what I found was that it was all the way back to Mesopotamia to a woman called Enheduanna. Hopefully I'm saying that correctly. I don't know. She wrote poetry, she wrote hymns, and she recorded her own personal history, kind of like a diary. And when I dived deeper into this, I was sort of just looking at like, hey, when did this become a thing? Because, for example, last year, it might not have even been last year, but I'm pretty sure it was. I think in 2024, maybe it was 2023, fantasy, this idea of like romance-heavy fantasy, became a genre, something that is tagged, and like new adult has kind of come in and then gone out and then come back in. Genres are sort of created categorically all the time in the literary world. And so I was curious, like, well, when did women's fiction become like a literary genre? And I found this article from the Huffington Post, and there's a lot about it. I'm going to quote a lot of it. So, and I'll tag the article in the show notes, so if you want to read the whole thing, you can. So in this article from the Huffington Post, it says, "I've yet to see an analysis of a male-written book which states both men's fiction readers and readers of literary fiction will enjoy this book. Why? Because there is no genre referenced in reviews as men's fiction. Googling it, I couldn't find much beyond Esquire's self-proclaimed short stories labeled fiction for men." This Huffington Post article goes on to say, "It is certainly no accident that the most mainstream as well as genre fiction is popular amongst women. For that reason, publishers and booksellers have identified a category within the mainstream that they classify as women's fiction. And it is no surprise that virtually all the selections of Oprah's book club are in this genre. From a writer's perspective, some key characteristics of the books include a focus on relationships or one or more strong female protagonists, women triumphing over unbearable circumstances, and the experiences of women unified in some way." So the article was really great and it was really informative, going back and forth on this idea of why women's fiction is considered separate. But the article ends with this quote that says, "We don't need firemen and firewomen. They're all firefighters. And those writers we love, we don't need to call them writer men and writer women. We can call them writers. And we can call the novels they write just that, novels." It then further ends with a quote from Bell Hooks that says, "I'm so disturbed when my women students behave as though they can only read women, or black students behave as though they can only read blacks, or white students behave they can only identify with a white writer." And I think this is just summarizing essentially what January is getting at, which is just like women's stories are of equal value, and that if you swapped out all the Jessicas with John, like, you're just telling stories about life. You're just telling stories about life from a very unique perspective, but why should that eliminate or be different than other literary works? So I just really loved this article, and even though I could not find a specific time in which women's fiction became like definitively a category, like when these two things were separate, knowing that the first writer, women's writer, goes all the way back to Mesopotamia lets us know that like women have been telling their stories, you know, in this case of Enheduanna, like writing her own personal history, that women sharing their own experiences has been a pivotal part of women's culture, and that we don't have to keep these things separate, because when men are telling fictional stories or writing fictional stories, they are interesting to women because we can recognize the value in it, but that for some reason women's fiction gets separated because it is seen as something to be diminished or something to be less than. And why that may be, and how do we bridge that gap. Because listen, my girl January was stressed about this, and I just want to make her feel better. And I thought it was a really interesting point. Like, you could tell this grates on her. This is something that's so important to her throughout the book. And we'll talk about, you know, why in a moment. But I loved this idea of why are these two things separate? And there really seems to be no other reason except for sexism and misogyny on one side of the scales and marketing. Like, hey, women just tend to buy more books, so it's easier for us to separate them. At least that's how it was posed in this Huffington Post article through their research. And so I found it really interesting, and I know it's something that we'll probably explore as we go deeper through some of Emily Henry's other books. But that was what was on my mind today for our Femme Frame. Let's jump into our Quickie. This is your official spoiler warning. I know we've already started to dive into some of the stuff from today's episode, but your official spoiler warning that I will be recapping this book as a Quickie, and we will be doing that through major themes and the character arcs through those themes. So if you have not read Beach Read, it is officially your time to skedaddle. All right? There is an overarching theme that happens throughout this book, and that theme is what I am going to call lost and found. Because to me, this whole story, Beach Read, is about the different shades of who we are and about being loved for all the different variations of ourself. And that sort of gets broken down into these micro pieces. Our grief, choices versus fate, trust after betrayal, and then forgiveness. So let's start with these character arcs for the themes of grief. When we meet January, January is like going through a bit of an identity crisis. She's spent her entire life trying to romanticize it because of her mom's terminal illness, #normal, only to find out at her dad's funeral that her dad was having an affair, that her mom knew that her dad was having an affair. She's now inherited this house, has to like clear all of it out and sell it. And in the midst of this, her shitty ex-boyfriend, Jacques, breaks up with her. Listen, I'm not sure if I mentioned this either, but her BFF, Shady, lives in another state. So if you are somebody who has a long-distance bestie, which I am, you know that going through this entire shit show that January is going through at the beginning of this book, you are just feeling the weight of it even more because you don't have the person that you need, like, with you to help you. January at the beginning of this book is a really interesting character because she is the embodiment of, does the lie become the truth? So life, right, is like full of these silver linings or full of dichotomy, and it is one of my favorite things in real life but also in books to explore sort of like the weight of what dichotomy can be, and especially for something like grief, which is very cyclical in its nature. It is not a linear path. There are just times and periods where you hit that low again. And for a character like January, she's learning throughout the arc of this book, throughout her journey, not just how to process her grief, but how to really reconcile her ability to handle ambiguity and what that middle, that gray area is. That idea of the silver lining, in my opinion, like no one clocks it better than a romance writer or a romance reader. And I think for January, as a stand-in of what it is to be a romance novelist and to look at life this way, she needs the piece that balances it out, and her grief is the thing that is lifting the veil of what it is to romanticize her life pretty consistently. And it's why I was really hesitant to put as a trope grumpy sunshine, which I've seen people categorize this before, but January comes into this book like-minded with Gus. She is cynical. She is not trusting herself. She is in such a state of grief about the loss of her father, and not just the loss of her father, but like her memories of what she thought her life was and everything that she thought she knew. There is an undercutting of that and a betrayal of that, which we'll talk about a little bit later in its own like separate arc. But when it comes to January, as far as her grief goes, there is this thing that she is trying to do from the beginning of the book where she's like, I just want to romanticize my life, and having to start this book for herself. Like, we start this journey with January at the father's second house, at this like love shack that doesn't have any tidbits of January or her mother here. It is just her father and this like separate piece of his life that existed that January didn't even know about. And so she's in grief and she's trying to understand the ambiguity of what it is to love somebody and care about somebody and have all of these incredibly important and cherished memories. She idealizes her childhood and the fact that they were all able to get through all of these hard times, and the love of her father. Like, she loved her father. He was a role model to her. And then to understand that this person wasn't who you thought they were. And the grief that comes with not just the physical loss of him and his death, but the emotional comping that she has to do to understand who he actually was. There's a quote that January says, "And that was the moment I realized, when the world felt dark and scary, love could whisk you away, off to go dancing. Laughter could take some of the pain away. Beauty could punch holes in your fear." And then she goes on to say, "The point is, I started telling myself a beautiful story about my life, about fate and the way that things work out, and by 28 years old, my story was perfect." So by the time we get to this place with her in the beach house where she's like, I don't want to think about my dad here. I don't want to think about him having like sex with somebody else. I don't want to think about, you know, these pieces of him that I didn't know and didn't have access to, and that in fact, not only that, I'm angry that somebody else got to hold these pieces of him that I never had. And this idea that he's had sort of a long-term affair, it changes her worldview. It changes her belief in the idea of a happily ever after, and it's making it incredibly difficult for her to write these romance novels where she is promoting a happily ever after, because her worldview is slipped right now to the point where her rose-colored glasses about the idea that you can tint something in this favor or in this light all the time, that's been ruined for her. That's been dismantled. That belief has sort of been the rug pulled out under her feet. And she has to then reestablish her worldview in order to even be able to write anything at all. And of course, what makes this so incredible is that Gus is the person that helps her do this. But it is the grief of the worldview, I think, that is more prominent for January. She goes through this and trying to become somebody who is willing to look at the dark, heavy pieces, or look at the pieces that are not so beautiful, that are not so dolled up, and to be taken seriously in that context, especially by Gus. There's nothing wrong, by the way, with being somebody who looks on the bright side. In fact, like, psychology basically says that if we are looking for good things will continue to happen. So there's this idea in psychology, it's called the red car theory, which is like, if you're going to buy a red car, all of a sudden you start seeing red cars out all over in the world. And this is true, right? Like, if we are training our brain through gratitude and through this notion of romanticizing it like January does, then yeah, you can be somebody who sees the good in the world, but that doesn't stop your father from dying. That doesn't stop him from having an affair. And this is something that Gus will discuss with January later on, where he's like, you don't understand. I'm trying to protect you, not because I think that you're weak, but because I think the way that you view things is actually beautiful and strong, and I want to preserve that for you and for your readers and what that means for the world. The joy and the love and the perspective that good things happen. I like that you bring that out into the world. And even in being somebody who trains her eye, trains her mind, trains her heart to look for the beauty in life, here's the thing, when you're grieving, grief doesn't make sense. Like many heightened emotions, but grief in particular doesn't necessarily make sense, and everything becomes a little bit duller when you're grieving. And sometimes the focus is so singular on that person that almost like blinders, the rest of the world can go away while you're zooming in on this one particular person or this one particular scenario in your grief. And January, again, isn't just grieving the physical loss of her father. She is grieving her comprehension of what her entire life has been. And so by having this worldview changed, she's clinging on to these moments of joy and happiness that they had together. But when she reflects back on these things in actuality, she is questioning her trust in herself and how she is recalling things and what that actually means for a little bit of her own sanity. that she could get something so wrong about her life that she was living and experiencing. She's wondering whether she can even trust her own perception of reality. She even goes on to call herself New January, where she is rewriting herself in light of the revelation of it all. So part of January's arc too is seeing the story for what it is and writing the story for what it is. And I love that arc for her, especially as a writer. Even when the glass is half full, and I'm like a glass half full girly, even when the glass is half full, it tips over. It's just organic for things to change and shift and move. And sometimes it comes with like, okay, the glass is tipped all the way over. Like, what are we going to do with it? And for January, whose mom had 2 bouts of active cancer. She had parents who separated and then got back together. She had a boyfriend who expects her to be this like adornment of their life, or like this adornment of really his life and his idea of what relationships should be. January has to learn to be the sunshine girl. She has to learn to be the person that sort of tamps down her fear, her anger, her sadness in order to be in the moment and be happy for all of these people, and not to be happy to like keep the peace, but to be happy and not miss moments with people that she loves and cares about, and to make all of these moments perhaps more dressed up than they should be, because she's really, even before her dad passes away, grieving the potential loss of her mother while her mom has cancer. She is like pre-grieving, and she's like, I don't want to miss out on anything with her because these are important to me. So she's like dressing these moments up so that in the event that she loses her mom, she can look back and be like, look at those beautiful, incredible, romantic, lovely moments that we had together. And she can't do that all the way with her father, knowing what she now knows. So when she moves into his secret to her lake house, it forces her to face the physical remnants of his other life and forces her to come to terms with this over the course of the book. On top of that, on top of all of her grief, the 2 people who could provide her with any sort of clarity are her mom and Sonia. And her mom refuses to talk about what happened, which drives a wedge between her and January. And January refuses to talk to Sonia because of her anger and disappointment in her father, and that this woman in front of her pretty consistently throughout the book is a physical representation again of this piece of her father that she never knew and will never have access to except through this very painful experience. And in fact, for the majority of the book, she doesn't even refer to Sonia as her name. She calls her that woman. There is such a disinterest in even personalizing, humanizing Sonia, because in a way that actually makes her father more culpable. We also know that the grief is sort of long lasting for her. And again, grief is a cyclical thing, but when it comes to Jacques, there is also this idea that is being set up for January, that these heavier pieces of her, that when she is not the sunshine girl, she is not going to be reciprocated. So when she starts pushing her mom for answers, now all of a sudden there's a wedge between her and her mom. And when she is depressed, can't get out of bed, type of depressed, not an abnormal thing when your father passes away and you're very close with your father and you love him and you're also having this revelation about who he was and what he did. She says, Jacques said again and again, he told me I wasn't myself, but he was wrong. I was the same me I'd always been. I just stopped trying to glow in the dark for him or anyone else. She also says, breaking up still sucked in every conceivable way. But once the initial pain wore off, memories from our relationship started to seem like just another story I'd read. I hated thinking about it. Not because I missed him, but because I felt bad for wasting so much of his time and mine trying to be his dream girl. And then, of course, what Jacques says to her, which is, you're not yourself, you're not yourself anymore, he told me. We don't work like this, January. And there's a mask that she's putting on as the sunshine girl. That's what I want to call her. And when the mask comes off, Jacques is like, I can't deal. And again, the grief of what that is, to say, well, it's not that I'm different or that I'm not myself. It's that I'm not trying to glow in the dark and make all of these bad things, my mom's cancer, my parents separating, all of these things that have happened along the way. I'm not trying to dress them up or make them lighter than they are. I'm actually just sitting in the dark. And the fact that Jacques is not somebody who can handle it. In fact, like, Jacques is somebody who leaves right after the funeral. That's like a fact that when I read it in the book, I was like, ew. It reminds me so much when I was in high school. One of my close friends at the time had been dating this guy who was a little bit older than us, and he became like a part of our circle. You know, in high school, you're like friends with everybody, or at least I was. And so he was a part of our circle and somebody who was really important. I saw him all the time. He was my really good friend's boyfriend, and his father passed away. And she had an appointment. She was missing school, but she had an appointment for something else. And I'm not going to say it wasn't important, but it was like not the same level of significance, right? And she wouldn't cancel the appointment, and she didn't go to the funeral. And I remember saying to my mom, like, this is important to me, I want to go because he's a part of my day-to-day life, and I just feel like I should be there. And there was a ton of people from school there, but I remember sitting at the very back of the church while this funeral is unfolding and just thinking, like, this is one of the most significant moments in this person's life, and his partner isn't here to support him. And the fact that Jacques left so fast after the funeral that he was not even there by the time Sonia approached January, which was in the church, in the back of the church. So Jacques is out of there so fast. Like, January hasn't even mopped up her tears yet, and he's so far out of there. And to me, that is just already letting you know that Jacques is somebody who can't deal, right? Like, he's avoidant. He's actually like the antithesis of what Gus is, who is like, I want to peel back all of the layers of people's pain and understand why they've made these choices and understand who they are at their core. And Jacques is somebody who's like, I don't want to look at anything ugly or hard in my life. I want to be fancy and cook it and do all of these beautiful romantic things. Staying for 5 minutes to even get you back from the church to the limo or whatever they drove in, like, he wasn't even there for that. And if that is somebody who you're partnered with, you don't want to go through life with somebody like that unless you are also the same way, which January clearly isn't. She's like, I am the same as I always been. I am just not stuffing it down within myself anymore. I am letting it emerge and letting other people realize that I am impacted by this stuff. She's been impacted since the beginning, impacted by her parents separating. She was impacted by, you know, her father having this affair. She's impacted by her mom having cancer and then going into a relapse. So it's not like she's not affected by these things. And just because she has reached for the good pieces doesn't mean that her fear isn't also driving some of that story forward for herself. So I just thought that Jacques is important to mention here, because then by the time she then goes on to re-meet, since she's already met him, Gus, she is at a point in her life where in this beach house, in this lake house that her father had, a physical representation of a piece of her father that she did not know, that she has to discover and grieve all over again, is a period in time in which she is quite literally looking the devil in the eyes. And she is moving through these ugly pieces of life and allowing them to emerge in a way where she's not really trying to force it. And of course, she can't do this necessarily directly. She can't necessarily do it head on. There's tons of time throughout the book where she's like, I can't deal with this right now, and avoids it. As to the letters, when it comes to certain rooms that she has to clean out and certain tasks that she has to do, anytime that she brushes up against Sonia in these different areas of the town. But what she can do is really lean into this rivalry, which maybe in college was not so healthy for her in the way that she was perceiving it. But by the time we get to January at present, having this healthy rivalry with Gus, a place to go into to lean in and really experience what it is to look at the darkness head on and have an outlet for that, somewhere to understand her own processes of how to even do that. The cult interviews become a really great place for her to be able to leverage some of her own understanding. And having Gus as this soundboard, you know, they're helping each other in so many ways, but Gus is really helping her, being able to pick the nits about what it is to be somebody who is experiencing their grief and questioning the choices that a person that you love and care about made. And I think that, you know, by writing in this other genre without intending to really, I think what Gus offers her is an opportunity to dive deeper into her perspective that she's always had but has tampered down, and it gives her a platform to explore this new perspective safely. And therefore, the deeper she goes into this book, The Family Marconi, the more she's able to deal and cope with the ambiguity that is happening in the world around her in her personal life. And so we get at the end of her arc, sort of at the end of the book, where January says to herself, like, in this grief of not knowing what is going to happen with Gus, she's faced at the end of this book, like, knowing that Naomi had come to this book reading that they were doing, or this book talk that they were doing, and that there is a very real possibility that Gus, who she perceives as like a huge commitment phobe, who like actually has just been yearning for her since he's met her, since 23, that she is somebody who has to get to the end of this book and say, the experience that I had with him, no matter what the outcome is, if it's not a happily ever after, that does not mean that this experience and what I have gained from it is not profound, and that it's not impactful. And having to balance out, I can have feelings and have lusted after somebody, and I cannot know where it's going. And I can also know, in this quote that she says at the end, which is, I couldn't know what Gus was going to tell me about the other night about Naomi, or where we stood. I couldn't know, but I could survive it. So having to learn to live in that sliver of the yin and yang, the silver lining, the happy for now that they talk about in the book, the balance of all of that light and dark moments of life is exactly what her trajectory is throughout the course of this book. And so while she is busy mourning the fairy tale, the happily ever after, she is learning to live with contradiction and ambiguity, and she can do that by the end of the book. By the time that she unfreezes, like, Gus is knocking on the door and he's like, please just let me talk to you. And by the time she gets to the spot where she's drawn together with him at the end, as he's saying, like, Naomi asked if we can get back together. And I was like, yeah, I could see it. And she's like, her stomach falls. Like, she's giving us these visceral physical cues that her body is rejecting what is happening. But her mind, her inner dialogue is like, hey, Shady's inside. You will have Shady here, like, there is going to be an after. This will be okay no matter what happens. You will have support, you will have love. So I just love that this was her journey, and that grief was sort of a huge part of her arc. Gus has a similar type of arc, though his grief is much quieter and a lot more deep, I would say. It is a grief that is born not only of the physical loss of his mother and her death and her passing, but the abandonment that he felt from her while she was alive, the abandonment that he has of his father and the role and the delegation of, like, fatherhood and what it is to be a good father, and obviously, like, the abuse that he experiences, the difficult relationship that he has with his father, who is abusive. And then he's got a failed marriage, one of the only people that he has decided to commit to and committed to long term in a marriage. And then his wife left him for his best friend. And his cynicism is one of the things that he's overcoming. He's like grieving all of these different pieces and trying to reconcile something within himself about what is missing, that people don't want to stay with me, and grieving this idea of January leaving at the end of summer and not wanting to be just a notch on her bedpost. So his cynicism is born of something real. It's born of real trauma. And I'm not saying January's isn't. Obviously it is. She lost her father. Her mother had cancer. Like, these are traumas of the lifetime, but his is so much more buried and so much quieter in the way that he explores it and understands it. And he avoids the vulnerability. He avoids all of the vulnerability by honestly intellectualizing emotion and seeking perspective through these interviews, especially with the cult, right? That he's doing this book on cults, that he's interviewing people who have made alternative choices than he may have made, but to understand why it is that people are making the choices that they make, especially his mom, who he was like, I was ready for her to leave. Like, I had a bag packed with comic books and socks and like granola bars, and I thought we were going to get on a train and get out of here and ride it to the last stop. And grieving the fact that she didn't, grieving a choice that he had no control over, and trying to then process and deal with his grief through interviewing people who have made similar choices, and why people have stayed in cults, and why people have gotten out of them, or why people have stayed in bad situations, or why people have gotten out of them, and trying to find his happy medium with what his understanding of his mom is. So even when it comes to this idea of him trying to get on the train with his mom and wondering why she didn't leave, January then says, the corner of his mouth was curled, but the smile wasn't real. It said, isn't that ridiculous? Wasn't I ridiculous? And this idea that he is somebody who had hope, and every time his mom elected to stay in this relationship, eroded at his hope, not just his trust. Not that he was born cynical, not even that it had anything to do with his father. It was his mother's continuation of staying. And he even says, like, she never said to me we were leaving. This is just something that I had hope that it was me and her against him and against the world. And that erosion of his hope, not just his trust, but his hope, that as a young child, he didn't have that thing to hold on to. And January almost had the opposite, where, right, she's all these bad things, but her unit comes together and they are trying to romanticize things and create more consistency of a life that is wider, bolder, brighter, bigger, romantic. And that Gus was living in almost an opposite situation, and then even worse once his mother died. Gus had an opportunity to leave with Pete, and he stayed. And trying to understand not just why she stayed, but why he's continued a cycle to stay and live with his father, who was abusive out of his own guilt or shame or whatnot because of his father's medical issues, and having to grieve the choices that he's made as well. So what I love about Gus is that he wants to believe in what January is selling. And he even says it to her. He says, because you're the bright light. Don't you get it? He shook his head. It's not about what's happened. It's about how you cope with things, who you are. You've been this fierce fucking light, and even when you're at your worst, when you feel angry and broken, you still know how to be a person, how to tell people you love them. So he wants to believe in what January's selling. He wants to believe in hope. And just so interesting that she is somebody who is trying to break out of being this glow stick in the dark for other people, where she's like, I'm just always going to shine so that they can shine. Like, we're just giving Lizzo right now. If I'm shining, everybody's going to shine. Okay? January is the embodiment of that. And he sees that in her and doesn't want to exploit it, but actually holds incredible reverence for this aspect of her, that he appreciates it. It's not something that she is being forced to do. And in fact, in this entire story with Gus, January is like, take me to these interviews, take me to the graveyard, take me to the fire, take me, let me see. And Gus keeps kind of trying to protect her, like, just get behind me, like, don't look, like, I don't want you to see this, and not wanting to see his own grief as he moves through these different parts of the process of writing this book, right? And January's like, I want to see. I'm not hiding behind my pinky fingers anymore. Like, I just want to look. Like, can you just let me look? Can we just deal with this together? Can we be in this in this moment together? And not realizing the depth that Gus looks at January as the hope, the last grate of hope that he has that has not been abandoned or trampled by his upbringing. That's January. That small little sliver is January, and he's like, that's why I want to protect it, because this one piece of me that is holding on to dear fucking life, to this last little shred of hope that I have, like, that's you, and I don't want these dark things to influence the one hope, the one light that I have, because that's who you are to me. And I just love that so, so, so much. So he has another quote too, where he says, when you love somebody, he said haltingly, you want to make the world look different for them. So time out, because if you haven't read Great Big Beautiful Life, I'm just going to say, similar theming. Okay? Little Easter egg, similar theming. It's not the same language exactly. It's not you're going to remake the world for them, which is what they say in Great Big Beautiful Life, but kind of similar. So on timeout. Okay? To give all of the ugly stuff meaning and amplify the good. That's what you do. For your readers, for me, you make things beautiful because you love the world. And maybe the world doesn't always look how it does in your books, but I think putting it out there, that changes the world a little bit. And the world can't afford to lose that. And more importantly, he's saying the world can't afford to lose that, January. People need hope. People need something beautiful to latch onto. People need to believe in the idea of a happy ending. But really what he's saying is, January, I can't lose that. I need you to put out happy endings. I need you to make me believe in something bigger and more beautiful than what I'm currently experiencing. And I love that. So through January's emotional honesty and her being somebody who can not only tell him like, hey, I can take all of this. I'm not breakable. That's not going to break this part of me that sees it. In fact, it's helping me understand ambiguity for her journey. She doesn't say that, but her emotional honesty is what actually helps him to begin to create the space for a deeper connection again. So that is our grief journey. Now, sort of interwoven with that is this idea of trust after betrayal. And for January, she starts off very closed to new relationships because of her father's betrayal and honestly her ex-boyfriend's dismissal of her in her state of grief, and really her mom's inability to even handle her questions or her commentary about, you know, her father and stuff too. So she starts off sort of like the valve is off. Her most important people, her best friend lives in a different state. She isn't really talking to her mom. Her boyfriend broke up with her and she's lost her father. So she doesn't have this like incredible support system around her. She's really cut off from her emotional connections at this moment in time. And her idea of happily ever after now feels naive to her. She starts to distance herself from her own heart. And she even says, how could I trust what Gus and I had? How could I trust my own feelings? People were complicated. They weren't math problems. They were collections of feelings and decisions and dumb luck. The world was complicated too, not a beautifully hazy French film, but a disastrous, horrible mess, speckled with brilliance and love and meaning. So she's trying to do the mental gymnastics. Like, how is it that I can hold on to this thing that I am creating with Gus? How do I trust my own feelings? When she is somebody who is living in this space of trying to dismantle and rebuild her worldview and trying to trust her own gut again. And that's why at the end of this book, again, coming back to this moment where she's like, I can survive it. Like, I don't know what's going to happen with Gus, but I can survive it. That's really just her saying, I trust myself to get through whatever comes next. I can handle this. I can handle that. So I love it because she ends up rediscovering over the course of this book that love can be real even when it's not perfect, even when it's not super romantic, and that this disastrous, horrible mess speckled with brilliance and love and meaning is exactly what it is to be going through the life journey. I love that there is this piece where January asks for Gus's trust. And in the book, they're sort of having this moment where he is revealing to her, like, I had such a thing for you in college. I was so down for you. Like, I wanted to sit next to you in class. I would brought my books so that I would be able to talk to you after class when everyone else was leaving, just so that we would be alone. He's like, and even when I would talk like directly to you, like you wouldn't even look at me. So he's like, I never knew what I did that made you hate me so much. And all I wanted to do was hang out and get to know you. And she's trying to rearrange this story that she's written about him in her mind. What I love about this exchange is that Gus says, I'm going to mess this up. And January's like, maybe, but that's not what I asked. Tell me what you want, Gus. Not why you can't have it, or what you think I want, or why you can't give that to me. Just tell me what you want for once. That's all I'm asking you to do. And he says, I want you. And he goes on this whole spiel. And then he says, I've always wanted you. He says, I also want you to be happy. And I'm scared I can never be the person to give that to you. And what I love is that she's asking for his trust in this moment. That she's saying, I see the fear. I see what you're bringing to the table right now. I get it. And she goes, then let me be happy with you, Gus. She even goes on to say, I kissed him softly like the rare and tender thing that he was. And I just love this because she's asking for his trust and he gives it to her. He lays out all of the good, the bad, the ugly. And he goes, this is how much fear I have about this. And she's just like, okay, I've got it. And so they're like rebuilding that trust together, that they're understanding that these pieces of them that are not the happily ever after, right, that end up being what they call the happy for now, that they have to trust in each other even though they have both been betrayed and are both working through that betrayal. There is also an overarching theme about forgiveness. So January's relationship with her father is a central piece of this. She has to forgive him. She also has to forgive herself for not seeing things clearly, both with her father and her family and also with Gus. And then she has to forgive her mother for not looping her into the story. She wrestles with this idea of, did he choose us? Did he love us less? If he could love two women, what does that even mean? And then coming face to face with this exact same realization, the same mental math that she has to do about her dad with Naomi. And as Sonia's going on her whole rant at the end, January's like, he was married, talking about her dad, and her sub thought is, Gus is married, which is true. And there are, maybe we could do some of our own moral, ethical math about what is or is not correct. But as January continues to try to do this mental math over the course of the book, she's having to learn, again, that space of finding out who her father was and wondering whether or not she could actually forgive him, and not having her mom there as somebody who can even go there with her, because her mom is also in grief and also moving through her own process. And then finally, when she ends up having this conversation with Sonia, Sonia ends up saying, maybe he thought if he sent the key and the letter straight to you, there'd be no one to stand here and convince you to forgive him. And January's like, yeah, actually, my mom probably wouldn't have told me all of this. This actually probably would have been something else, that just like this conversation when Sonia showed up to the funeral, like my mom probably would have just never gone there with me, and maybe I would have never known. And so as uncomfortable and as angry as she is, and perhaps even disappointed in her father, for Sonia to stand there and tell her this story, and for January to then have to again find this balance between accepting that two things can be true, that her father clearly loved her mother. This is something I think feels clear to me, and I think it's even clear when Sonia says it. She's like, I had no disillusionment the second time anything happened. Like the first time I thought that this was the love of my life and that we were getting a second chance, and she's like, in the second that your mom got sick, he was out of here faster than you could say bye. And I think for Sonia, going back into it the second time around, you know, she loved him and couldn't reconcile her own balancing of who this man was when they were teenagers and who this man became as an adult, and that his priority was his family, but that this was sort of like a detour when things were very unclear in his life, not knowing, and that clarity settled in once the cancer diagnosis became their reality. And January also have to reconcile that within her own mind, because she's in a situation with a man who's technically married and who, while they have no real assets or anything together, they were slow to put the divorce through. And he was like, I just wasn't focused on it. By the time I figured out that she wasn't going to get to it, I put something in, and now like we're still negotiating this stuff. And so like the divorce is kind of going through, and it's in its own process by the time January discovers that he's married, right? But that January has to be the one in her own mind and heart to reconcile that this woman that she hates, Sonia, who could have an affair with a married man, is really no different than January is, who is falling in love with somebody who, just like Sonia, who had a relationship with her father before her father ever met her mother. That January is also somebody who knew Gus before he knew Naomi, and that they had this sort of interesting relationship, not necessarily romantic, but certainly some sexual tension. And what that means for January is literally a direct mirror to this woman that she hates, because this woman is a physical manifestation of the imperfection of somebody that she loved and cared about, and a physical manifestation of things being messier than they seem. And then January having to forgive herself for putting herself in the same position with a man like Gus, who she's like, he's told me from the beginning that he was married. He's told me, like, all of this stuff. He doesn't tell her from the beginning that he's married, but he tells her pretty much by the beginning that he's married, and that they go on this journey where she realizes, even if she doesn't directly say it, oh, we're the same. We're the same because we're falling in love with somebody who does not have a clear and direct path to be with us at this moment in time. And what that will mean for her relationship with Gus, especially by the time we get to this part with Sonia. This is at a very low point in her relationship with Gus, and a very big question mark hanging over them, and having to deal with that while processing the fact that he may very well be, while she's having this conversation with Sonia, getting back together with Naomi. She goes on this process of forgiving her dad with Sonia. She goes through this process of forgiving herself with this experience of Sonia, and then we have her relationship with her mom. And when she starts the book, she's like, we're not really on speaking terms. Mom would never visit me there, where she was living before. We hadn't done much visiting this past year anyway, apart from my 3-day trip home for Christmas. She dragged me to 4 yoga classes, 3 crowded juice bar, and a nutcracker performance starring some kid I didn't know. Like if we were alone for even a second, the topic of dad would arise and we'd burst into flames. All my life, my friends had been jealous of my relationship with her. How often and freely, or so I thought, we talked. How much fun we had together. Now our relationship was the least competitive game of phone tag. So not starting off on a great note with her mom, and she has to spend a lot of this book confronting her relationship with her dad, but also confronting her relationship with her mom. She's spent so much of her life trying to make it better for other people and trying to cope with her pain and her grief of the cancer diagnosis by being somebody who makes things more lavish and makes them more decorated, only to find that the silver lining, dancing in her living room, having this great relationship with her mom, isn't necessarily what she thought it was, and having to understand that her mom is somebody that she has spent a lot of time with but doesn't also necessarily know, or doesn't know in this way, and how she's going to bridge that gap over the course of the book. I also love that she just finds romance novels by waiting in the hospital room with her mom, like in the waiting room, and that romance was just a comfort for her, this like security blanket during a period of time when she was in such pain, and that she goes on to then wanting to provide that for other people and help other people find that escape. And just how deep this is for her love of romance. It's also why, in part, it's like painful for Gus to be seemingly picking at it. So when he says, like, let me guess, everyone lives happily ever after, again, she's taking that to heart because this was something that has provided her a distraction, something that has provided her an outlet and a place to go. And so this is also something that she's like moving through a space of forgiveness with her, not just her mom, but her connection to romance and what this entity has been in her life over the course of the years. And she even says about Gus, I wasn't ready to let him trash the one thing that had meant more to me than anything else, the genre that had kept me afloat when mom relapsed. Of course, he doesn't know that, but this genre saved her. It kept her sane. It gave her something to home her attention in on and focus in on during one of the most rough periods of her life. There is also a spot where January then overhears her parents arguing, and her mom says, I feel like it's over. And her dad says, our marriage? And the mom says, my life. I'm nothing but your wife, January's mother. I'm nothing else, and I don't think you can imagine how that feels, to be 42 and feel like you've done everything you're going to do. And so not only what it is for January have to forgive her mother for not telling her about Sonia, but what it is to have to also understand that her mom was conflicted in her own choices, and then especially probably even deepening that when faced with her own mortality later on in the book. So not January's mortality, the mother facing her own mortality through her cancer diagnoses. Let's just make that clear. So as January starts to getting her writing groove back, she has a particularly long night where she then texts her mom. She has like 12 hours where she's like, I was sitting in front of the computer, basically like not eating, not peeing, like not drinking anything because I didn't even want to get up. And after this long night, she texts her mom just to be like, hey, I know that things aren't perfect between us right now, and I just want to let you know, if you're never able to talk about dad again, like, I still love you and I see you. And her mom writes back 20 minutes later and is like, I love you too. So just knowing that her mom and her are trying to find that, and her mom is even like, I hope one day I can tell you, I hope I can tell you everything, that they're trying to bridge the gap in their own way, but that their grief is just so heavy and that they have to forgive these different pieces of themselves. The mom has to go through her own journey, which we don't know what that is, but January is to forgive her mother for not being somebody who can hold her hand in this grief because she's moving through her own. The mother is moving through her own. And what I love most is that by the end of the book, in recognition that her own journey with Gus is messy after this confrontation with Sonia, she ends up calling her mom, and her mom answers right away, and she's like, you know, did I tell you that Jacques, the shittiest boyfriend ever on planet Earth, broke up with me in a hot tub? And then the two of them are able to find common ground, and they start to rebuild their relationship because January's like, it's messy. You know what? If she's not able to talk to me about this thing, it's fine. We can talk about other stuff. Like, did you know that Jacques broke up with me? That he broke up with me while we were on vacation, and that he broke up with me in a hot tub? And being like, we don't have to talk about dad to like talk and to have a relationship and to find forgiveness and understanding that, and acceptance really, that the relationship again can exist in the gray space, that it doesn't have to be we only ever talk about it on my terms or we don't talk about it on your terms, that we find somewhere in the middle where it's like we don't broach this topic for now until we can. And in the interim, like, let me tell you about the things that have been happening in my life. And she's like, I told her everything. It's a little bit different than January and her dad, where the perspective and intent and impact all have a role here, because the perspective that January has of her dad at the beginning and at the end versus the intent of what he does and the impact of what he does, and understanding that there is gray area in there, that when he reconnects with Sonia, he is separated from his wife. And so there are no clear rules. We don't know what the rules of separation are for their particular marriage, but could say in these modern times, most people who separate do get divorced. And most people who, so I don't have the statistics on that, but most people who separate get divorced, right? It's like a trial run for divorce. And most people who are separating do start seeing other people. This is just something that's really common, I think. And it doesn't mean, listen, we don't know what the conversation was. I'm sure that as people are separating, you are clarifying what that means in the parameters of your own relationship. And so we don't know what their relationship status was at this point, but we do know that the intent of what he does versus the impact of how it lands for January all those years later are two completely different things. And she's like afraid to walk into the house. She's like, it's a sex dungeon in here. And so to find out that this affair actually happened further in the past, like many, many years ago, and never really picked up again after that, there was many years where her parents were genuinely together and very happy, and whatever that was for them, whatever was sitting between them, like it wasn't necessarily that they were unhappy for all of this time, and having to, you know, balance that within herself too, and find forgiveness for her father for what he did and how it impacted her, and find forgiveness for her mother for not telling her, and all of these different things. And so I love that this idea, right, with these different relationships that January and Gus have and explore over the course of the book, that if this idea of being lost and being found, and that through grief and forgiveness and acceptance and trust, that we are able to find ourselves and to connect with other people in those gray areas, then January's overarching evolution of this story is choosing her own story, choosing her own path. And at first, it feels like January has no control. She's like, my dad lied to me, my boyfriend left me, right? She's broke, she's creatively blocked, she's burnt out, but throughout the novel, she actively reclaims her agency. She chooses to move into the beach house and deal with this thing that she's got with her father. She chooses to write a book outside of her comfort zone. She chooses to have a relationship with Gus despite her fear of being hurt. And she even says, like, let me be happy with you, Gus. Like, just let me be happy with you. I'm choosing you. I want to be with you. And Gus has like an opposite journey where he has to let January choose him. That's why this moment for me, I know everyone is like obsessed with the end where he's like, when you sleep, I get overwhelmed that you exist. But for Gus, it is this idea of no one ever chooses me. And so I have to allow myself to be chosen by January and open this door to vulnerability, to be chosen by this person that I love and care about, because he carries deep fucking wounds from his childhood, okay? He has hashtag mommy and daddy issues. He has got both, okay? And I think so does January, but less so. Gus really has like daddy issues and then like really also has mommy issues. They're like more subtle, but they're both in there. So he carries these wounds from his childhood. His mother never left his father, which was a disappointment to Gus and scary to Gus. He then went through the loss of his mother. His mother dies, and then his father was abusive on top of all of it. And he felt stuck in this relationship with his father. So he internalizes all of that as, I'm not somebody that people choose to prioritize, right? I am not the priority here. And when it comes to like college, he says to January, I'm not the kind of guy that women try to date. I never have been. I'm the one they want to hook up with. So he says to her, like, I don't want to be the person that you rebound with after you've just had an amazing relationship for 7 years with an incredible doctor. Like, I can't handle that with you because you're somebody that I actually am starting to really care about and have always cared about. By the way, this line with like, I'm not the guy that women try to date, it was giving me Johnny from Dirty Dancing. You could just swap out Gus right there, Salt and Pepper Gus, with Patrick Swayze, and I would have believed that they were the same person having the same conversation, because that's exactly what was happening here. Naomi also leaves him for his best friend. Like, nobody's chosen him. And January has this thought where she goes, Gus thought he was missing something, some special piece that other people had, the thing that made people stay. It made sense all at once. The hesitancy and deflection, the mistrust of people, the fear of commitment. No one had ever chosen Gus. From the time he was a kid, no one had chosen him, and he was embarrassed by that, like it meant something about him. I wanted to tell him it didn't, that it wasn't because he was broken, but because everyone else was. But I couldn't get any of the words out. I couldn't do anything but stare at him, standing there out of steam, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths, an ache for him, and hate the world a little for chewing him up. I mean, just an incredible quote, and to be able to recognize that this is how he is processing and dealing with things, that he feels that he's never been chosen. And so when she's like, let me be happy with you, she's saying, I am actively choosing you, even though this is messy. I know that you think that I can't handle messy, but I can, and I'm actually saying, let me choose you. And he has to open the door to her and let that be a thing. So he doesn't believe in lasting love. He even says, like, when Naomi and I got married, I knew that that's what we were going to have. We were going to have 2 lives. They're separate lives that were happening together in maybe one space, but they weren't one life that was sort of enmeshed and brought together. And he withdraws. He withdraws again and again throughout the book because he is somebody who, when he realizes that there's a possibility that they might choose him in the messiness, he's just like, well, let me just take that option away from you. And he even says, like, January, everything I've done in the last 24 hours has hurt you. The way that I'm handling this is like hurting you. But they have to work through that, and he has to be able to let his guard down enough to be chosen. And with January, he recognizes that he is being chosen, and he's afraid to mess it up, that if he does something wrong, that all of a sudden she will like unhook herself from his car. And he's obviously gone through this multiple times, but especially with Naomi, right, who like leaves him for his best friend. And, you know, it terrifies him, I think, because he's chosen January even all of those years ago. He's been into her since day one. We love a man who yearns. He's been into her since day one. And all of the recollections of their time have just been a matter of perception. Like, January perceives him as a pompous asshole, and he doesn't even admit to this. He's like, I was a 23-year-old elitist dick. But he never thought that he was better than her. And he's like, I thought it was obvious how I felt about you and your writing. And for January, it wasn't. She was like, you're nitpicking me for no particular reason, dude. Like, I fucking hate you, even though you're sexy evil Gus. Okay? And he's been into her since day one, and like he was dating somebody, broke up with a girlfriend, like had it so bad for January. It was so down bad for January that when January just looks at him at this party and they're having this like intense eye contact and they make their way to each other and they dance and it's very salacious, he leaves the party to go break up with his girlfriend and that he was dating at the time, because he's like, I'm just fucking so down bad for January. Like, I couldn't even control myself. Like, cheating, not cheating, whatever you want to call it. Like, I know that this isn't right because I have feelings for her and I would. So I love that his arc is to be chosen, and that January's arc in Lost and Found is like to find her own path of choosing the story that she is going to write instead of just saying that everything's going to be this happily ever after. All right, Dear Diary is a segment that has not yet been able to come up, but I've had it in my notes every week. Sometimes I will sprinkle anecdotes of things that have happened in my own personal life, but Dear Diary are my own personal stories, and I want to just say that there was a lot of notes in this book. I'm a huge Kindle reader, and I read this book, like many people, during the pandemic in 2020, on lockdown with my Kindle. I bought a Kindle in 2020 because I was always an avid reader, and I was like, wow, for the amount of time that I have, I'm not going to be able to read or afford like the physical amount of copies of books that I will blow through. So I ended up spending the money on a Kindle, and I hooked up to my Libby and to my library card, and my life was forever changed because then I started reading even more, because then I was always afraid to like bring my book out of my house because I never wanted my physical copies of books to get dirty. But with a Kindle, you can stick it in your bag. So 2020 sucked for many reasons, but it introduced me to Kindle life, and I will never look back. I love an e-reader. Anyway, I read this book at a time when I was dating somebody who was incredibly emotionally unavailable, and this book hit me like a gut punch. And I had so many notes in this book, just skeletons of my annotations past that came up in this book as I was reading, and just to be able to look at my notes from 2020 and realize how far I was from that person and where I've come now, and how many changes I've made because of that relationship, and how many quotes that January said that resonated with me as like somebody who is looking at Gus as like an emotionally unavailable person, and what that means, and how I felt about that in 2020 while I was in the midst of dating somebody who was emotionally unavailable, when I, like January, am like a serial commitment person. It was, and having to deal with the ambiguity, by the way, my own journey of having to deal with ambiguity in relationships and that things are not always so clear cut. It was such a fascinating thing to be able to reflect on that as I moved through this book and see how far I've come, and see, I loved this book in 2020 when I read it, and I was nervous to kind of come back to it because I was like, is it not going to be what I remember it being? And just to read it again and have a different experience through it, and not be in the emotional state, and to be able to go on a different emotional trajectory through Gus and January's love story was so profound for me. And anyway, Dear Diary, I just want to let you know that I have grown so much from 2020, and I'm so proud of myself for getting myself out of a relationship with somebody who, unlike us, was not going to choose me, and who I'm very glad that, unlike January, who chooses Gus, that I am somebody who decided to leave the situation. And in the story about choice and fate and what we are meant for, and people who stay in cults or bad relationships with people, and trying to understand those decisions, like looking back and being so grateful and so proud of myself for leaving a situation that was not good for me. And to all of the people out there who read this book, or to all of the people out there who are in a situation right now where maybe you're not ready to leave, but you know something's not right, I hope that you find support. I hope that you find the people that you need to get you out of it. I know that I had a really good support system around me at that period of time in my life, and still now. And just know, like, I'm here. You can send me a DM on Instagram. You can send me a message in our email, femmeandfuriouspod@gmail.com. And I say that because going through a relationship that is with a person who is so emotionally abusive or unavailable wears on you in such a way that you cannot even imagine. And so if you're in that situation and you've read Beach Read and you're like, I see myself in this and I am starting to question or wonder about my own choices or decisions, I'm here. I'm here for you. I'm not the only person that you should have as a support system, but I just want to let you know, like, I am 100% here for you. This is what my job has become. I've gone out and deliberately tried to help other people with this through my spiritual work. So you don't have to book a reading. I'm not like trying to promote myself. I'm just trying to say, like, if you need somebody to talk to, I just want to let you know I see you, I love you, and I know that there's so much of this in here. And I hope that one day in your experience of Dear Diary of life, I hope that you find something, that period of time in hindsight where you leave something and you look back and you go, I'm better off for it. So that's my Dear Diary. Let's go into Hot Girl Hot Takes. These are quotes that I didn't put anywhere else, but that I really wanted to talk about because they made me laugh. So she's like, I took a cold shower, or at least I took 1 second of a cold shower, during which I screamed the F word and almost broke my ankle lunging away from the stream of water. How the hell were people in books always taking cold showers? I turned the water back to hot and fumed as I washed my hair. I relate to this, January. I always say when people are out here doing cold plunges for health, I am the opposite. I am like, if you could make this water scathing and it is just 1 degree away from hell, that's about how hot I want my shower to be. And I don't understand why people take cold showers either. I understand the health benefits. Please don't be in my inbox telling me the health benefits of it. I already know. I work at a health resort. Be in my inbox for your emotional stuff. Don't tell me that I should be taking cold showers. I'm never going to do it, okay? And I'm just going to say, hot showers are for the girls. And I think January is really real for this quote. I also think the fact that Shady and January have nicknames for people like Sexy Evil Gus, or that they call him like Haunted Hat, or, you know, that January in her phone is like Mike, the guy from the vintage antique shop. Like, that is so real to me too. I constantly do that. I have people's names in my phone as like Jackie from blah, 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 blah. And I do this all the time, and I think they're very real for that. And I think creating nicknames for people, especially men, is very real. And again, for the girls. There is also in a quote where he says, exactly. Anyway, I actually prefer the beach in the winter. And January goes, really? Because in winter, I just prefer to be dead. And I also resonate with that as somebody who lives in seasonal weather. I was designed to snowbird. I was designed to leave the winter. It's very pretty for one day. I don't mind it. Give me New York City at Christmas time. Other than that, I would like to be on a beach somewhere. So when Gus is like, I prefer this beach in winter, I'm like, no, thank you. I am like January, I'd prefer to be dead. So I just thought they were very real quotes anyway. Those are my hot girl hot takes. Okay, let's crack open the burn book where we look at the superlatives for this episode. The Bold and Bothered Award. What's it like writing Hemingway circle jerk fan fiction? Do you know your readers by name? That was my favorite quote. I love that interaction between them. I laughed out loud. Certainly probably the first time I read this in 2020, but definitely this time. And then as I was looking through my quotes, laughed at it again. The Shiro Award. This is going to Shady. And there is a quote in the book where January says, I started to cry again so hard I couldn't see. I opened my text with Shady and typed, I need you. It was seconds before she answered, first train out. Shady is an incredible best friend, and I love her. So the Shiro Award goes to Shady, who was like, I am on the first train out to you, babe. The Femme Fatale Award. This is when January is talking to her mom, and she goes, did I tell you that Jacques broke up with me in a hot tub? And her mom responds appropriately, Mom gasped, that little shit weasel. So I loved this quote, and also again made me laugh, like just the relationship that a mother and a daughter have, and also just like how shitty it actually is that somebody would break up with you on a vacation in a hot tub, and that this is her mom's response. I thought that was really funny. All right, Speak Your Truth trophy. My favorite quote and my favorite part of this book perhaps is all of the letters from January's dad, but in particular there is this line where he says, I want to keep you forever. Who am I without you? And it's just so interesting, right? Because he writes these letters to January every year on her birthday. And earlier in the book, before the mom has her first cancer diagnosis, when she's like, I feel like I've done everything I'm supposed to do by 42. Like, I'm January's mom and I'm your wife, and like, that's it. Like, this is my whole life. And I don't think that you could possibly understand that. And meanwhile, writing these letters to January, he goes, I want to keep you forever. I don't know, who am I without you? I don't know who I am without you. And like, where these things that define January's mom feel almost claustrophobic, for her dad, being January's dad is like the role of his lifetime. So I just love that. I thought all of the letters, but in particular, who am I without you? Who am I if I cannot define myself against you, is such a beautiful and profound part of the book, and really made me cry. Honorary heartthrob. Okay, we are blasting our Sinead O'Connor, and we are singing Nothing Compares to You. That Gus remembers that she had a Sinead O'Connor like phase of her life, like a shrine to her. So he plays Nothing Compares to You. He comes out, he dances with her in the rain. She's like, you're going to dance with me in the rain? He goes, I promised you I would promised you I'd learn. I told you I'd try. And then we obviously get the quote that is like the quote of the book, which is, when I watch you sleep, I feel overwhelmed that you exist. So that is our honorary heartthrob moment. We love a deep track romantic moment. We love a big, bold gesture from Gus, the anti-romantic, doing this big romantic gesture for January. I just loved it. And obviously everyone else does too, because it's the thing that if you look up this book at all, people are like, when I watch you sleep, I feel overwhelmed that you exist. So that is the most important, maybe not the most important, but I think the most honorary heartthrob moment of the book. All right, thank you for listening to this week's episode of Femme and Furious. If you like this episode, share it out on social media. And until next time, go chase your happily ever after.